Hi there, I'm Samuel Doveri Vesterbye, Director of the European Neighbourhood Council and host of the MEDIATIZED EU podcast series. Today, we're wrapping up our deep dive into the MEDIATIZED EU project, a four-year initiative which is funded by the European Union through the Horizon 2020 program. And this project has brought together partners from a lot of different countries, 7 countries: Belgium, Estonia, Georgia, Hungary, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. And in previous episodes, we've explored the various stages of our research, quite long and comprehensive research. We've been sharing the key findings from the desk research, media analysis, elite interviews, civic discussions, and also the nationwide surveys across the countries. And so now that our teams have completed their research, I'm quite excited to welcome our 2 special guests for this final episode to cover the key findings, as well as maybe most importantly, or most specifically to this podcast, the policy recommendations of this project. So joining me are Dr. Tetyana Lokot, who is the PI of the MEDIATIZED EU project and also Associate Professor in Digital Media and Society at Dublin City University in Ireland. Hi, Tanya.
Hi, Sam.
And I'm also joined again by Dr. Sonia Boulos, who is an Associate Professor of International Human Rights Law at the Faculty of Law and International Relations at Antonio de Nebrija University in Spain. Hi, Sonia. Very happy to have you here again.
Thank you for having me again.
So, first, thanks for taking the time to share the main results and, of course, the recommendations for this project's research. Let me start with you, Tanya. For the past 4 years, we've studied how the media discourses are constructed to foster or hamper the European project and how they resonate among the public by focusing in part on this elite media triangle or elite media public triangle. So can you maybe provide an overview of that main research, its outcomes and findings, and also what is the potential contribution of the project to what we know about the European project and its media representations?
Thanks, Samuel. That's a really good questions, and I think it's first of all just to acknowledge the sheer amount of work, including research and dissemination, that all of the project partners have done over the past 4 years. It's been a very long journey, but I think now the results of our project are more timely than ever because, with the European Union facing all of these new challenges, from very evident threats to democracy, media freedom, and European values in a number of member states, as well as from external actors. We've seen election interference, continued security challenges posed by the Russian aggression of Ukraine. We're seeing political polarization. So I think our project is very timely in that it offers some insights into how seemingly separate things like media coverage of the EU, how the elites talk about the EU, what the public perceptions are, how all of these converge, and how they come to shape what we think about the EU, how it's represented, and potentially what it would look like going forward. So I think, one of the key contributions of our project is that it acknowledges that media have immense power, and that power is in how the media talk about certain things, like aspects of the EU, how it works, what its politics are, what its values are. And I think our project really shows that it's important to look at all of the sides of the triangle that we're so fond of bringing up: the elites, the media, and the public. One of the other main contributions of our research, I would say, is that we have a very diverse selection of country cases, right? So we have Belgium, where the EU headquarters are located. We have the northern part of Europe represented by Ireland, the southern part represented by Spain and Portugal, and of course we also have Eastern enlargement countries such as Hungary and Estonia, and we have Georgia, which is an Eastern Partnership country. So we have this diverse country set. We have a groundbreaking mixed methods research approach. We use qualitative, quantitative, and deliberative research methods to really examine this elite media public triangle from all sides. And we show how the discourses which are platformed by the media then connect with and impact how the elites talk about the EU, how focused the elites are on either the European level or their own national level, and then what the public end up knowing or not knowing about the EU and how it shapes their perception. So in terms of just a few key findings, and I'll kick this off, but I know that Sonia will have a slightly deeper insights on this. I think one of the things we found that might perhaps be surprising to our audience is that pro-European discourses actually dominated media coverage about the EU across almost all of our partner countries. So Belgium, Georgia, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, and even in Estonia, where there was a smaller difference between pro-European discourses and Eurosceptic discourses, there was still a bigger share of pro-European discourses. And it was really only in Hungary where we saw a somewhat greater proportion of Eurosceptic discourses, which were mostly concerned about national sovereignty, but not necessarily, departure from the EU or anything like that. So what we also saw then is there was also evidence of overall elite consensus that all of these countries were kind of set on an inevitable European course. So the elites, again, while there were lots of differences, which we'll get into, they all felt that the European course, European integration is inevitable. And at the same time, the other key thing we found is that these pro-European discourses, which dominated, also were largely going hand in hand with a more pragmatic approach to Europeanization. So, talking about very pragmatic issues, which we saw in our dominant discourses like recovery funds, the European economy, the role of Brexit, dealing with COVID-19 pandemic, dealing with Russia's aggression against Ukraine and its threat to European security, protecting human rights. We detected these in most countries. And even in Georgia, which is a non-member country, where discourses were less about specific policies, still pro-European media outlets highlighted things like protection of human rights, democracy, financial assistance. So again, things were still quite pragmatic. So we see that there's this focus on what are the pragmatic benefits of EU integration. And we, of course, also saw some identity-driven arguments, right, which maybe talked about the threat of the EU to traditional values or national sovereignty. And these arguments were mostly used to disrupt this consensus, which I just talked about. And they were present in our countries to varying degrees, but we saw that they were more prevalent in spaces where leading political parties, which are tended to be conservative or right-leaning, were the ones driving these discourses. So we see some tensions between identity and pragmatic considerations, and much of this is driven by elites as well.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for that comprehensive answer. And let me indeed turn to Sonia to talk about some of those differences. So Sonia, what are the key insights that emerged from the analysis across all 7 countries? And maybe in comparing the cases from the different countries, what notable similarities and differences did you observe?
I'm muted. I'm going to follow up on what Tanya said, that as she mentioned, in most countries, not only the discourses, but the constituencies are very much, supportive of the European integration project. And it's true that in most cases, discourses tend to be pragmatic, focusing on specific policies of the EU. But within this, and also what we know so far that usually identity-based arguments are used to discredit the EU or construct it as a threat to national identity. But we also discovered that identity-based arguments are also used to support the European integration project. For example, in the case of Georgia and Estonia, some of the discourses are very clear that we are European, so that's why we should be part of this European integration project. So it was interesting to see that not only identity-based arguments are used to discredit the EU, but also they can be used to kind of support the project. And sometimes they can also be used to create, let's say, hierarchies within the EU, like who's more European within the Union, who is the genuine representative of the EU core values. We see these discourses, for example, when human rights record of Eastern European countries are discussed in the media. where there's a discourse that, perhaps some of the members of the union do not really, embrace the European values. So it was interesting. Another thing that is important to highlight, that political polarization could have different impact on the European integration project depending on the political context. For example, Spain is a highly polarized country. But the fact that the European integration project is supported by all the political actors, the major parties, was also reflected in the media, that you rarely see, harsh criticism of the EU, because the EU is a consensual political project in the country. The EU is perceived as an important actor that helped, to democratize and modernize the country. So political polarization could mean different things for the European integration project. But in countries like, for example, in the Hungarian context, or even in the Estonian, and to some extent in the Georgian, when the EU itself is, could be a contested project, polarization is more evident in media discourses, where you can see that there are certain, or, attacks on the EU. And also an important point that even in countries where the EU is not a politically contested project, it can still be instrumentalized internally. Again, I want to bring the example of Spain. So Spain is a highly pro-European country, but still, that doesn't mean the EU is not instrumentalized. It is used as a leverage to attack political opponents. So one way to attacking or discrediting political opponents is by presenting them as deviating from the European path, as not being very committed to the European legal or normative framework. So you see this, for example, in debates on the appointments of the High Judicial Council in Spain, when it was a very controversial issue. So both parties accuse each other of not doing this well, even from a European perspective. We saw this in relation to Next Generation funds, where the opposition accuses the government of misusing the funds. So still, it can be instrumentalized, even in the most pro-European context. Another interesting thing that we kind of wanted to highlight, that it is true that European constituencies, at least in the 7 countries, is very much pro-European. There's a general support for the EU integration project. But this support coexists with low level of knowledge about the EU. And that could be an issue, especially if you take into consideration, the public opinion surveys that we conducted that indicate that people are, trusting less and less traditional media outlets, and they're looking for information from other sources. So the fact that you have, very pro-European publics, but that at the same time don't know much about the EU, something that the EU should take seriously, especially given the lack of trust to some extent in traditional media outlets. So maybe this could be used, or it could open a window for other actors to try to kind of disrupt the European integration project. So that was one of the main things that we wanted to highlight in this project.
Oh, thanks. Overall, we see a lot of pro-European sentiment, but indeed perceptions differ and contexts are different. So I wanted to maybe also ask Tanya, what are the main factors which impact the representation of the EU? Like, are there convergences or divergences between old and new Europe? So, and also Eastern Partnership countries like Georgia, like first between, the traditional Western Europe or Europe that became or founded the European Union, and then members that have joined since then.
I mean, I think it would be very difficult to say that that's literally where the convergences or divergences are, because as we found, there are many factors that sort of overlap in complicated ways that impact the particular representations of the EU. I mean, one of the things Sonia has just mentioned is the fact that the public just lacks knowledge about how the EU actually works or operates, and that makes it very difficult to to assess, whether what the public thinks is based on any particular knowledge or facts, or if it's just based on some sort of feeling that, is in part informed by media discourses, maybe by the polarization and the conversations among the elites. So we see that all of these are influencing what the public is thinking. But I think on a higher level, even between when we look at the differences between so-called old and new countries or countries in the Eastern Partnership, I think it's not even necessarily the particular histories or when they joined, but it's more about the country's own perceptions of their place and position in the EU that makes a difference in how they talk about the European project. For an example, countries like Portugal, but on the other hand, also Hungary and Estonia, are very much concerned with this center-periphery dynamic, where they don't see themselves at the center of the EU in terms of how much power they have or decision-making capacity, but they would like to be, right? And we also see, Poland is obviously not one of the countries in our project, but we can see similar tendencies. Poland thinks that it's perceived by older Western EU countries as kind of being on the Eastern periphery, but at the same time, it would very much like to and thinks it should occupy a place much closer to the center. We see the same dynamic between North and South divisions, which is very evident in Spain and Portugal, for instance, where, even within the countries, we see this perception that I don't think the EU takes us as seriously, or we are seen as peripheralized, but I think we should actually be, either the decision-making center should move towards the south, move from the north, and this is similar to divisions between East and West. But we also see this in terms of the size of the country, right? So Ireland, for instance, is a very small country comparatively to other EU states, but it thinks that it should have more importance and should have a more prominent place in EU decision making, and in a way that also shapes how it perceives its own importance to the EU. And I think for Ireland, we got a big boost with Brexit and all of the negotiations around Brexit, when Ireland actually saw tangible proof that the EU did actually care about Ireland's interests, right, and was willing to advocate for them. So, there's this very complicated set of interdependencies in terms of the country's own perception of its position in the EU, what is happening in its political landscape, is there media plurality and independence, is there government capture of the media, which we sort of see happening in some of our project countries, what types of internal polarization exist, are they related to the perceptions of the EU, or are they more along the more traditional political lines? So, these to us emerged as the main factors which impacted the representation of the EU. And obviously, this opens up, the paths for much deeper analysis. So we do hope that our project, one of the things that it does is that it actually prompts other researchers and also policymakers to probe deeper into some of these findings.
If I may add to what Tanya, but also you have to take into consideration that even within the same country, you can have different approaches with even like within what we might call pro-European camp. Just to take the issue of center periphery. So in Portugal and also in Hungary, you can have even kind of conflicting discourses. In what sense? That yes, there is a perception the country is being treated, as on the margin, as a periphery. But who's to blame for that? You have different discourses giving different answers. For example, you could say that this is the EU's problem. The EU is not taking us seriously, or it could be seen as an internal problem. We're the one who are not doing our job correctly. That's why they're not taking us seriously. So even within the same country, you can have different views. And also, which I'm grateful to Tanya that she brought this up. I mean, the question of, power asymmetries within the EU are very, very, very important. You can see them in discourses in countries that historically had issue with this question, and how it could, could be manifested in different ways. Like if you compare Portugal and Spain, both southern countries, they had similar, trajectory in terms of, they had dictatorship, then joined the European integration project more or less at the same time. And they both, were perceived as, the periphery of Europe. But the discourses in Spain are different. Of course, there is a concern, or I even would say resentment, especially towards the austerity measures of during the Eurozone crisis. Like people still remember, people and elites still remember the harsh impact of the austerity measures. And when they discuss the next generation funds, they're always like sending a clear message that the days of the men in black are over, that this is a different Europe that is taking the, economic well-being of everyone, equally. But in Spain, they perceived, especially after, Brexit, as the, one of the biggest economy in the EU. So you can see this desire that like, we're going to play a more important and dominant role in the EU. And you see these in the discourses, for example, on the capping the prices of gas, that, this is the exception that Spain pushed for. Whereas in Portugal, with a smaller economy, you don't see these discourses. So I'm trying to say that, there's a lot of nuances that should be mentioned that merit, more analysis into, more specific questions. But at the end of the day, I mean, as Tanya suggested, it's very hard to compare this in a simplistic way, because even within the same country, you can have different trends, even among the same camp. And just to give you one more example, when we did the elite interviews, combining the Q methodology, again, I speak a lot of Spain because it's a context that we were, more familiar with. So even within, political elites are very supportive of the EU. It was obvious that geopolitics and security issues were very important for the people we interviewed. So they gave this issue a high importance in discussing the EU. But within the camp, like, let's say, left-leaning political elites and media elites, there were two perceptions of the EU geopolitical role. One that, views the EU as too dependent on the United States and NATO, and that it should enhance its, military capabilities. The other view was, no, after Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we really did, reacted well. We can see that there's more coordination at the European level, more solidarity. So even within the same camp, on the same specific issue, the same political party, you can see different views. So that complicates, in a way, our job in trying to do these simplistic comparisons between countries.
Thanks for diving into these specificities of the research, especially in the Spanish and Portuguese case. I'd like to now move from kind of the findings to maybe also discuss the recommendations, because as with all pieces of research, one part is the research and the findings themselves. Another part is how do you put it into practice? How do you get policymakers, whether it's at a national or EU level, to implement based on this research and findings? So Sonia, let me continue with you. Across the 7 countries involved in the MEDIATIZED EU project, what are the main trends and common themes, specifically with regards to the policy recommendations that emerged? And also, if possible, if you can reflect on the current societal and media landscapes in these targeted countries with regard to the recommendations.
I'll start with this, the most simple one, and it was very common. Disinformation. Disinformation is a concern for every single country in that, like, it was all the teams had disinformation in their recommendations, either to local policymakers or to the EU. So the EU needs, and local policymakers need to deal seriously with disinformation. That's one. The second thing I would say is, I just want to group everything in kind of one category, that the EU needs to communicate in a better way, to reach out in a better way to European publics. That there's this sense that people don't know much about the EU, they don't know much about its institutions, how it functions. In the group discussions we held just to talk about the outcomes of our research, even when you talk to students at the university who study subjects like international relations, European studies, They also say that they have the sense that, yes, we support the European integration program, but we don't know much about it. We would like to be more informed. So in a way, reaching out is essential. Because as we mentioned before, support that is based on lack of knowledge, it's something that you cannot build on for a long term. So, and also there's this, the EU needs to kind of adapt its communication strategies because different countries have different, kind of priorities, needs, or worries. So you cannot have one strategy to all EU countries. So you have to be adjusting your strategies to linguistically, politically, depending on the context. There was a lot of worry about polarization itself, like how it could be, it could impact not just only the European integration project, but also how it could be impact, the democratic order in all the countries. So this was a theme that was more common. We're in the kind of expectation for more transparency, so people know exactly how things are being done at the EU level. But then you have some, kind of comments that are more specific to specific countries. For example, countries that have that the media is kind of under threat and under attack, that is threatened, by, state laws. So in this context, for example, you have to be focusing on this as well, how the state is trying to diminish the space for, public debates and political debates. So this is more specific. For example, in a country like Hungary, there were also some concerns about, some of the measures that were adopted, to respond to, the government's lack of compliance with the European frameworks, and suggesting that the EU should be more careful not to impose measures that could affect, the public in general, that this could be kind of counterproductive. For example, funding for research, things like that within the countries. So these were more or less, like, I would say, the three big themes: disinformation, communication strategies, transparency, and reaching out to publics, and also, recognizing how polarization is a serious threat to the democratic order.
I think it's
And
really
if
yes.
I could just very briefly add, I think that it's very useful how Sonia's kind of, pointed to these three key pillars of, disinformation, but also the importance of informing the public and supporting free media, or, ensuring that there is a pluralist media landscape. I think, to me, this also points to how these findings, that emerged, and these policy recommendations that emerged from our project, if we then look at some of the other results, like, how much trust do citizens have in their national governments versus the EU and EU institutions, to me, this also suggests that perhaps another point in terms of policy recommendations would be also thinking about how we could actually increase and foster public's trust in governing institutions. Obviously, in terms of national context, this depends, right? Because ruling parties change, governments change. But I think just in overall, because we saw that in the majority of countries, they tended to trust EU institutions slightly more. But there was still, a lack of trust in both national governments and often the media. And because both the national governments and the media are so vital to how the EU operates and how it implements its policies across all of the member countries, it's very important to think about how to strengthen public confidence in the governing bodies. But also, maybe, one way of doing that is also to ensure that citizens are able to participate in the decision-making processes. And I know the EU has already identified this as a priority, how to heighten citizen participation, but also thinking about it at all levels of governance. So not just at local level or regional, national, but also at EU level. And I think this, again, will help to some extent also to kind of disambiguate these things for the public, right? Where if they are invited and have opportunities to participate, either through citizen assemblies or through some sort of focus groups or through consultations on various issues of how the EU runs itself, it might also make it a bit less abstract for them in terms of, understanding how the EU works and what are all the different things it does to make their lives better.
Yeah, absolutely. Before, when Sonia finished, I was just about to say that I found it so interesting that the main recommendations that are shared across the countries are very much related to information and communication. Or you could easily have imagined that they said something else. There's a million other topics out there, but all of them seem to kind of revert around information, communication, and the link between the citizen and them. And when you then, exactly like you mentioned, Tanya, when you then look at the chronic problem of public trust, then all of a sudden it should spark a light bulb to policymakers who might reflect on, indeed, how do we communicate better, but also, as you mentioned, how do we change forms of governance structures for citizens to be involved. So I found that very, very interesting. Thanks for clarifying that, both of you. And now I'd like to move on to one last question. I would like to ask both of you, both you, Tanya, and Sonia, maybe starting with Tanya again. As we conclude this discussion, can you just kind of give the audience or the listener, the key takeaway or message that you really hope that the listener audience member will remember from the findings of MEDIATIZED EU project? It can be a recommendation, it can be a finding. What do you think should really be prioritized? What's the main challenge?
I mean, I think you've actually made it very easy for me to kick this off because, you said that it seems a bit surprising that, information and communication and the importance of having quality information and proactive, structured communication between EU and its institutions and the member states and the public in the member states. But I think for me that is, it's fortunate because our project is focused on examining information and communication and media discourses. But I think this is something that, the EU and all of the decision makers should be taking very seriously, right? And not just by kind of recognizing the important role of independent media and the quality EU affairs reporting, which we found to be, not at the level that we would expect, but really the importance of dealing every day with developing better strategies for how do we engage the public, how do we explain to them Europeanization, how do we discuss it to make sure they understand what the European project is, how it works, what its future is, right? And I think also all the while thinking about how to do better information and communication, also to recognize that you need to be dealing with these threats that emerge from political polarization, autocratic media capture, and this constant threat of instrumentalization in national contexts of how we talk about the EU and how we use it for to conduct our own political campaigns and, not really recognizing that if you use constantly your conversations and discourses about the EU to make points and score points in national political debates, it might actually just undermine public trust into the process of European integration. So I think, having that complex picture in everybody's head, I think should really be important because I think, the public takes kind of the EU for granted, perhaps, and doesn't know much about it. But the EU also takes support, I think, for granted, and I don't think it should, because if the public support isn't based on real knowledge and real engagement, I think that support could easily be undermined by all the threats we've already described. So I do think the EU should be very keen on, actually acting quite urgently on making sure that that support, both from the elites and the public, is actually grounded in something real and something tangible.
Well, let's hope that this new multi-annual financial framework with countries like Spain that are very keen on increasing the budget, and let's hope that they'll put a lot more effort and time into communicating better. Sonia, the same question applies to you. What are your main takeaways?
I mean, I think Tanya mentioned the key points, and I just want to add maybe 2 points. One that, just to continue what she said, I mean, talking about, for example, interviews that we conducted, you can see some sort of a generational gap in the way the EU is, understood, especially in a context like Spain. People who lived like politicians or journalists, senior journalists that we interviewed who lived through transition or were old enough by the time Spain, transitions to democracy, have a different understanding of the importance of the European integration project. They link it clearly with the issues like democracy, rule of law, human rights. Younger generations, I remember in one of the the discussions with the groups we had with students, why the EU is important. They were joking. The only thing that they can think of is the roaming charges for their phone when they're traveling, and that they can travel and study. These are all important things, but you see that is a very different conceptualization compared to people who live through the transition to democracy, how they perceive it from a different angle. So generational gaps should also be a factor when the EU is contemplating on strategies to communicate, to engage the public. But it's also important to highlight, the aim here is not to say that we don't. The critique of the EU is very legitimate, and for example, when you see the critique of the austerity measures and some of the media discourses, and when they compare the next generation funds with, it's essential in democracies that we can't criticize all political projects. The problem here is the polarization. It's like the strategies that divide the world into good people and bad people, into corrupt elites and the real people, into foreigners and people who are inside. So these are the things that are very worrying in terms of discussing the EU. And it was also encouraging to see in some contexts and some interviews that people take values like the rule of law, human rights, democracy very seriously. And this belief that if this project makes sense only if we are really truly committed to these values. You see this in discourses, for example, that were apparent in some countries on the way the EU was managing the migration challenge, how they accuse sometimes of putting an emphasis on security and less on human rights, or how the EU deals with different refugees and migrants based on across racial lines. So that was encouraging in the sense that you see that people believe in the project from an angle that is very kind of encouraging, that they're putting an emphasis on democracy, rule of law, and human rights.
Thanks a lot, Sonia. Also, thanks for clarifying this continuous problem that seems to be that people conflate freedom of speech with clickbait, sensationalism, and foreign interference. Even that's a circle to square, which is very difficult. So at this point, I think we've come to an end. I want to just take the opportunity, to thank both Sonia and Tanya for taking time to join, and I wish you both a really good day. And this is the final podcast in our project. So yeah, huge thank you to everyone in the team, of course. Now, if you're interested in finding out more about the MEDIATIZED EU project and the people behind it, then you can access a summary with our key research results, and you can also catch up on our publications. And all you have to do is essentially visit our website, which is www.mediatized.eu. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, or you can follow us on Twitter or X at mediatized_EU. As well as on our Blue Sky account. Thank you.